Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last session of the day before we go into a happy hour at least. My name's Carey Johnson. I am Director of the Division of Water. I'm very pleased to have a panel of esteemed colleagues to talk to us today about water, wastewater, community resilience, and what it takes for communities to bounce forward after a significant event within these various communities, like a major flood or a tornado that which we can all speak very clearly about, especially as it's occurred in Kentucky very recently, and we've had many communities impacted by disaster. Secretary Goodman alluded this morning that we've had 6 federally declared disasters in the Commonwealth since 2020. That doesn't necessarily account for all the small events that impact our communities each and every day. So I'm very pleased that we don't actually have slides to go through today. We're just having a good old-fashioned conversation, again, with some colleagues that I think provide a great perspective, and I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves here momentarily. But we have representation from myself from not only the government level, but also organizations, academia, and the private sector. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn it to the person to my right, Mr. John Dorman with AECOM, for him to provide just a quick overview of what you do, where you've been, and how we can keep this conversation going, John.
Sure. Thank you, Carey, and I want to thank Kentucky for letting me come in. Resilience has always been a very important thing for me. We have 7 children. Coming home, I'm always thinking about what's broken, how can we keep it from breaking, so certainly appreciate that. But my background, well, first with AECOM, I'm the Vice President who oversees strategy for both funding opportunities, but also for disaster resilience solutions. I came from the state of North Carolina, worked there for about 32 years. 13 of my years was in the state budget office, so that's where the desire for money came from. And then I also worked in the Division of Emergency Management as the founder of the flood mapping program, as well as the Resilient Risk Communications Group. After Hurricane Floyd in 1999, the state of North Carolina realized, as I believe Kentucky does, that water is the #1 hazard that you have. Resilience is critical for both the individual and the economy. But interesting enough, very quickly, resilience is different. It was interesting, the comments made in the last session. Resilience is different for an individual, for a structure, for environment, for infrastructure, and for the economy. And so that needs to be looked at holistically. And I think there's a lot of opportunities, both through funding and through events, unfortunately, such as the flooding, to look at these. So.
Excellent. Thanks, John. Appreciate that. I'm happy to introduce Mr. Scott Young, Executive Director of Kentucky Rural Water Association.
Thank you, Carey. Good afternoon. Just a little bit about myself. I've had the honor to join the Kentucky Rural Water Association. I started on July 1st, so got really big shoes to fill, because when most people think of Kentucky Rural Water Association, naturally they think of Gary Larimore and the 43 years of service that he has had within our industry. And, I'm joining a wonderful team, a very specialized team. There's so many different facets of what we do that really gets into the nuts and bolts and the daily operations of how we help water and wastewater systems. And of course, our mission is to help utilities help themselves. And I think through our discussion today, we'll probably get into some of that and what we do and those viewpoints. But just to give you a little bit more of my background, prior to joining the Rural Water Association, I was the general manager of the Glasgow Water Company for 17 and a half years. And most people are not familiar with the Glasgow Water Company, but just for sake of discussion, so you understand my background, the Glasgow Water Company, out of roughly 400 utilities in Kentucky, is the 10th largest water producer in the state. It's the 12th largest utility based off of customer connections, and I think the 8th largest utility in terms of distribution size. So come from a relatively large utility, and that transcends into when I joined the rural water team and starting to work with some of the smaller rural systems was a culture shock for me at first, just because of the nature and the magnitude of the staff that I had and the budget, and so yeah, I'm glad to be here and look forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, very much so. Thanks, Scott. Appreciate it. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Jason Unrine, Executive Director of Kentucky Water Resources Research Institute with the University of Kentucky, which I'm also happy to say I'm a proud alum of the University of Kentucky.
Yeah, in fact, I'm a professor in the department that you're an alum from, which is the
Yes, sir.
Department of Plant and Soil Sciences. So I've been at the University of Kentucky for about 15 years now, and I'm an environmental toxicologist. So my work really focuses on the fate and transport of contaminants in the environment, movement of contaminants into human exposure pathways, and then effects of contaminants on humans and ecosystems. So I also started on July 1st in my role, taking over from Dr. Lyndall Ormsby, who was a civil engineer, as director of KWRI. And so came in right before the flood, so it was, a little bit of a trial by fire right away. So in terms of, my expertise in contaminants, I think there are certainly some opportunities to, as we sort of rebuild and repair, to make our systems more resilient in terms of preventing releases of, harmful organisms and things like that during disasters and so forth, and making our systems better equipped to handle contaminants.
Excellent. Well, I hope everyone has realized through the introductions that we have great representation not only from the water quality aspect of water, but also the water quantity side. And one of the things that we've realized long ago, but maybe haven't necessarily torn down the appropriate silos yet, is the interaction or the interdependency of water quality and water quantity. So, I'm hoping that maybe our panel can provide us some great details on the inherent nature of water quantity and water quality, but also how academia, like Dr. Unrine, an organization like Kentucky Rural Water, private sector like AECOM, or the government, such as myself working for the Division of Water, can come together and collaborate in a more meaningful manner so that we can make our communities more resilient, especially after a major disaster. So, Dr. Unrine, I'm going to kick it back to you. No reason for us to, be very stringent with how we kick things here. So, from your perspective, especially the academia perspective, what do you think can be done for us all, and not necessarily at the on the panel here, because we have representation of four major components of disaster resilience and community resilience, but how do you think we can possibly work together and use some of maybe the lessons learned from academia or elsewhere to apply to some of our everyday priorities in other various natures?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things that, our state university system in Kentucky can bring to the table. One is obviously we have a pretty broad expertise on many of the issues, involved with disaster resiliency, but in research facilities, instrumentation, that sorts of thing. But not only that, we have very deep roots in the communities. So through things like the Cooperative Extension Service. So I think, as we look at solutions, they have to be appropriate to the individual communities or watersheds, and sort of facilitating that back and forth with the communities and developing these solutions is something that we can bring to the table beyond what you ordinarily think of in academia as just, the pure research component. So, I think that multi-directional communication that we've established, but then we also, branch out nationally and internationally. So there may be things solutions that our colleagues have developed in other states or other countries that, we can try to apply those in a way that's appropriate locally.
Mm-hmm. John, from your perspective, especially in state government previously, but now in the private sector, what do you think we can do, along those lines? How can we make communities, trust us as subject matter experts when we come in and tell them this is what you should do with your water and your wastewater. This is how you should manage your water resources, because you need to be looking 20 years into the future, where a lot of communities are literally looking 20 hours into the future because of some of the operational considerations and concerns that they have. So from your perspective, how do you think that we can work together to kind of bring a more robust resilience to communities as a whole?
Well, just from experience in North Carolina, it's very difficult to tell somebody they're in a floodplain and that they have to build their house up another 5 feet. Oh, and you're going to be paying insurance another $2,000 to $3,000 a year. What sells everybody is data and the wallet. And this is just from a perspective. There's 30% penetration rate on buying flood insurance. Why is that? People just don't believe a line. But if you speak specifically to their property, or if you're talking with a community and you say, if your water system's going to go down, this is what's going to happen to the economy, and this is what's going to be the vulnerability of your citizens, that's what sells. So if I could say it, data is the king. You've got to have the data that is at a specific level so that you can define what the mitigating strategies or the strategies would be for infrastructure. We talk about water quality and water quantity. Having a reservoir can both support water supply. It can also help out with hazard reduction. And putting those two together, AECOM being a large infrastructure firm, we can build anything you want, green or gray. But really the question is, how do we build it effectively to meet both of those needs? And it gets back to a very specific, what is it that you need? And so I would say data is critical. I think defining a clear understanding, and then, by having that data, it sells others to buy in and participate with that.
So tell a better story. Tell it with data. And it's very interesting that you mentioned the flood insurance penetration. In Kentucky, we actually have one of the lower penetrations of flood insurance across the nation. In fact, some of our analysis indicated that only about 2% of the folks that were impacted by the floods in eastern Kentucky in July had flood insurance. So, telling that story, but telling the story with data, I think provides additional value, but a perspective that we haven't always relied on. Especially coming from a regulatory agency. We are a do as I say, not as I do kind of situation. But it's really important to understand the collaborations that we have across the board in order to carry the message, because the message that we have, I think, is fairly simple. It's public safety, it's safe drinking water, and it's community resilience. And in various aspects, we all share that mission. But we all attack it in a little bit different way. So, Scott, I was wondering, especially with your experience in, a local utility, but now with rural water, what's your take on how we can collaborate in a more meaningful manner? How can we help folks understand or maybe change their mind? Because I think it's a scientific fact that it's really hard to change a person's mind with facts. So how do we change it either anecdotally or build more resilient communities from your perspective?
I guess the biggest thing when you really want to do an assessment of resiliency amongst your utilities is what's most encouraging is there's a lot of opportunity there for us. And I think we need to capitalize off that opportunity. And that can be multifaceted in that when you really want to drill down into resiliency at the utility level, we can invest infrastructure dollars all day long. We can put in the best water treatment and wastewater treatment plants. We can put in new force mains, new water mains, new lift stations, new pump stations. But I think we have got to get in front of the decision makers at the local level and make sure we stress the importance of not only do you need these physical assets within your community to be successful, not just from a quantity standpoint, from a quality standpoint, from an economic development standpoint, but we've got to focus as well on long-term operations, maintenance, and getting into finding a skilled workforce that can go in and optimize these plants. It's one thing to operate a water treatment plant, and you have an operator that's been there 32 years, and he knows that at 8 a.m. he fires the plant up and he turns this valve on, and we fill this tank, and before we go home we shut this. And there's so much more in today's terms of water quality and water quantity than just going through the motions or a standard operating procedure. We really got to make sure that the decision makers within the communities, through all levels of government, whether that's the decision makers, whether that's, and of course the regulatory agency knows, but we've really got to sell that these professionals within these communities are just that. They're professionals, and they're scientists. They're treating water. They are, making a long-term professional investment back into the community. And so we need to make sure that we always focus on the importance of finding those technical qualifications and those skill sets within those individuals, and that availability is there within the community.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you hit on something really important, Scott, and that's the ability to sell a message. So in selling a message, one of the ways that, at least over my about 20-year career, I've found an easy way to sell a message is to incentivize that message. So, John, I was wondering if you could talk about some of the incentives that are out there, and even maybe more specifically, one of the things that has been pervasive through today's talks is the amount of funding that is available either through bipartisan infrastructure law or any other means of funding avenues that have come available more recently. In fact, for the first time in my 20-year career, it seems like funding isn't one of the major constraints that we've had on progress. So, John, I was wondering if you could give us, a quick rundown, at least from your perspective, of how can we connect those dots at the state level, at the organizational level, even at the university level. I think we have access to varying resources, but it's connecting the dots and bringing it into a cohesive plan that I think we need to strive for. So I was wondering if you could at least provide us a rundown on what you know about funding and available resources.
So I was snickering, just not at Carey, but just that this is one of the areas I love talking about is money. And the unfortunate thing is many communities out there don't know what they don't know. The reason why they haven't tapped into is really two reasons. One, because they don't know what's available, and two, they don't know how to work it. I was in Pennsylvania a couple weeks ago trying to think about setting up some regional conferences, regional workshops to help the local counties understand what is available, because this is a generational opportunity. I can almost use the pun to say we are flooded by funding, which in a way is good, but in a way is bad. Let me just run down a couple of them. Of course, the ARPA budget, right? I believe Kentucky got $2.18 billion. Much of those dollars can now go towards water, wastewater, because the Treasury expanded the opportunity for that. IIJA. I could either read War and Peace last March or read the infrastructure bill, and I read the infrastructure bill. We came up with 418 unique opportunities of funding that equaled up to that 550. And in terms of water, there's 125 of them out there that are $91.9 billion over 5 years. A lot of opportunity. You've got the IRA bill. The IRA bill basically has 81 opportunities. That's $368 billion towards environment and climate. There is a significant amount of energy in that. There are some other specifics there, but I do want to also hit on, if I can, and that's the IFIA programs, if I can call it that, which is really the Infrastructure Funding and Innovation Acts. You've got the WIFIA program, which is water. That program's out there. There's a SWIFIA program for states, where you not only get your SRF funding, but you now also can take out long-term capitalization grants. You have an IFIA program, which is for energy. You have a TIFIA program for transportation. And these are programs that local governments and or state governments can look at long maturity rates of interest that lets you not only deal with the upfront building of it, but it helps the maintenance of it over 35, 30 years of time. And so those are all out there. The big point, though, is if you don't know what you need to buy and build, it's hard to match it to an actual project. So I guess the point that I'm seeing is need to develop a program and a project package that meets what those resilient requirements are, and I can promise you there's funding out there to do it.
Right. Well said. And, I would venture a guess at saying there's enough funding to go around for all of the organizations that are really represented up here today, whether it's academia, a nonprofit, a statewide organization, private sector, and the government sector. But it wasn't too long ago I was actually challenged by our cabinet leadership to start putting together what a disaster recovery roadmap looks like. Interestingly enough, whenever I Googled disaster recovery roadmap, FEMA had conveniently put one together already for me. But even more interestingly than that, it was 439 pages of guidance and 75 pages of nothing but bulleted funding sources that are available after a disaster. So how do you digest that, I think, is really more of the challenge than understanding that there are resources available, especially after a disaster. But I want to bring us back to, not only the funding piece, but how we tie safe drinking water and overall public safety to our various programs and community resilience. So, Dr. Unrine, I know that you've done some work with disinfection byproducts throughout the state. You've worked in one of our most vulnerable water systems in the Martin County Water District in eastern Kentucky. So, understanding that there are some probably more resources available now than there have been, at least in the recent past, from the academia standpoint and some of the work that you've done. What's your perspective on how universities or even academia as a whole can provide at least a little bit of additional perspective to us policymakers, at least at the state and the national level?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we can sort of bring to the table is just being able to do more detailed research on some of these systems to identify and prioritize what the needs are and how to most effectively use those funds. And beyond that, I wanted to sort of touch back on this workforce development issue. You can have the best infrastructure in the world, but if you don't have people that are adequately trained to operate it, so going all the way from the high school level up through community and technical colleges and the universities, to train up that workforce. I think many industries, education included, are sort of seeing this generational turnover, where we really need to build that up. And it partially starts with, increasing the professional recognition of those positions, the pay, things like that, to attract that workforce. So I think, those two things are probably what we can contribute to help, bring this together in a way that makes sense, that is sustainable over the long term.
Agreed. The workforce component is of utmost importance because if you think about it, it's those folks in the drinking water plants that are our first line of defense when it comes to public health. We drink the water each and every day. These are the folks that we need to support in our communities and make sure that they have the tools available in order to continue to provide us not only as policymakers, but also the less or the more vulnerable of our population understand, the American dream, so to speak, and live to their fullest. So, Scott, when we were outside chatting before the session here, one of the things that you mentioned was that, you bring an interesting perspective because, you mentioned you sat at the head of the 10th largest system in the state. But since you've been with rural water, your focus has shifted a little bit towards those more vulnerable systems, especially through providing assistance through rural water. So I'm wondering if you could provide us maybe a comparison of what that really looks like going from a system with a fair amount of resources. I'm not going to say Glasgow had all the resources that you need, but because everybody can, do more with more. But how does that compare to some of the systems that you're working in now, where their operations can be day to day or even hour to hour, or they're literally one disaster or one stress away from a shutdown?
Yeah, and I think, Carey, I think in your opening, or I'll call it an open statement, when you said some utilities are wondering what they're going to do 20 minutes from now versus 20 years from now, and it's easy for us to sometimes get lost in talking about asset management and really get into the vision of what a true capital improvement plan looks like and the nuts and bolts of those things. But for me, coming from a utility that did have a lot of resources, we had from an $8 million operating budget and a $5 million capital budget typically per year, a good qualified staff of 56 people that, we implemented a policy years ago where we only would hire water and wastewater treatment plant operators that had a college degree in chemistry, biology, environmental science, because we understood that whole process of being an operator at a plant that size was truly a science. And we paid dividends from that from a quality standpoint down the road. But so one of the biggest, changes for me in going into the rural water role was getting those phone calls in the office and talking with some of these smaller systems and just trying to get down and understand some of the day-to-day things that they face at that level. And it truly is some of the problems that are out there, not problems, just the things that they encounter. It's easy for us sometimes to get lost at the 10,000-foot view in larger systems or, within some of these agencies, because we think that some of those things is just customary, that they're handled, that it's, and that it's elementary, but it's really not. There is a need within these smaller systems for expertise, for technical assistance, for training, and just to have someone come in and answer some of those questions or show them, per se, the ropes of this is how you handle certain situations. So we have a huge opportunity ahead of us that's good to come in and assist some of these smaller systems and give them the support mechanism that they need and the resources.
Right. I think you said it very well, opportunity. Certainly anytime we have, a disaster or a major stressor to a community, there are shocks, there are impacts to not only the citizens, but also infrastructure and the like. But I think if we start viewing these as after the response, making sure everyone's safe, and unfortunately the last disaster we had that didn't occur, but understanding that, there's an opportunity that's presented with every shock or stressor that we have to our communities, we can really spring forward from those opportunities to invest intelligently and holistically to really provide for a better outcome. I think that's well said. John, I know we go way back. In fact, John and I served, we've way back in FEMA Region 4 FEMA meetings is kind of where John and I first started to rub elbows. John, we both served on the Technical Mapping Advisory Council, which is a council that provides input to FEMA at a national level on how to develop the National Flood Mapping Program. So John, if you don't mind, I'd like to take it maybe back to your experience when you were on TMAC, and especially, the work that you championed towards looking at future conditions and looking at the future and communities having a trigger that allows them to spring forward and build more resiliently. So I'm wondering if you could, just touch base about, maybe some of the best practices you not only developed while you were in North Carolina, but even some of those TMAC lessons learned.
Well, I'm going to go back to data again if I can. Sorry if that's not your cup of tea, but one of the things that we did in North Carolina that the TMAC promoted as well was actually collecting data at every structure level, 5.2 million buildings. Now, you may say, oh my goodness, that's going to cost a lot of money. Technology today, it's not. And by knowing where every building is and knowing every infrastructure, you can start applying present and future modeling on top of that. And that gives you a very good understanding of where to build to, what different mitigating strategies should you utilize, what's the level of infrastructure, whether it's water, transportation, whatever those are. Because it's very important, and something that the TMAC pushed, at least when I was there, is resilience does deal with people, it deals with structures, it deals with infrastructure, it deals with the environment, and it deals with the economy. It is an interdependent relationship there. And so you have to look holistically, and by having that information on the ground, it helps you make good decisions on where to build and actually how to respond to events. So, yeah.
I think that's well said. You know, one of the things, at least when I began my career, data storage wasn't as cheap as it is today. But data storage, and especially serving up that data in ways that folks can understand, whether that's a map, whether it's an infographic, whether it's a report. You know, I think that the simple fact of relying on data to help inform, not always make our decisions for us, but to inform our decisions, allows us to learn from the past, but also look towards the future and understanding some of the challenges that we can truly anticipate in some of the science that's been developed just over the recent, the not too distant past. So I'm going to transfer, the conversation a little bit, folks, and I hope that's okay. But I want to put everybody here in the panel. I'm going to hand you a crown, and I'm going to say, since we're all gentlemen up here, I'm going to say, if you were king for a day, what would you do to help folks understand the importance of safe drinking water, of sound wastewater services, and just overall water resource management that includes, good water quality? So, Dr. Unrine, I'm going to pass you the crown first, sir. And feel free to hone in on either one of those kind of priorities, whether it's safe drinking water, wastewater, water resource management, water quality, toxicology. You have the crown. How can we use that crown to help people understand how important that is?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about this a little bit before. I think when we have these kind of disasters, maybe one of the only times that people think about water. You don't think about it until it's not there. It's like breathing air. I think those of us in the room think about it a lot more than the average person. So, and I don't think we even really teach in schools, like where does clean water come from? What are the ecosystem services that, make that possible? What are the engineered systems that make that possible? Who are the people and the funding and the economics and all that makes it possible? So, if I had the ability to put that answer out there and do it, I mean, I think, it would be relatively straightforward. So I'm not sure that I have one single answer.
Yeah.
But I think that, maybe increasing people's level of awareness of what it really takes to be able to turn that tap on and, have clean, safe water come out. And I don't know what it would take to do that, because as has been said, data doesn't really convince anyone,
But I think you hit on the simple fact that teaching, I think, does.
Yeah.
Right? And, I think it's important. I have a 7-year-old daughter, and she rules the roost. There's no doubt about it. My wife's in the audience. She can attest to that. But one of the things we learn, I think, more from our children as grown-ups and what they bring home and what they message from schools than we would ever really pick up on our own volition by listening to the news or podcasts or whatever the case may be. There's a simple fact why Smokey Bear is so successful, and it's because the Forest Service years ago started educating the children. And I think it's hugely important that we begin, or maybe learn from that and begin the education of maybe not the hydrologic cycle, because that can get a little bit wonky, but letting folks understand how their water gets delivered to them. It's very anecdotal to the grocery store. You go to the grocery, you pick up a pack of hamburger, you go home and you eat it. Well, there's a very similar situation when you go to the bathroom or you turn on your faucet to drink water. Where does that come from? And for the most part, our water and wastewater infrastructure, it's buried. So it's out of sight, out of mind, and it's really easy to forget about. So I always like to, I have a quick anecdote that I always like to share when I'm doing presentations. And it's maybe a little bit of a dig at our friends at the Transportation Cabinet, but we all work together so well that I always like to say, you don't always necessarily need a road to get from point A to point B, but you're always going to have to drink and potty along the way. So I think it's important to understand that the water infrastructure piece is inherent to our modern way of life, and we've gotten accustomed to the resources that we have, and the Commonwealth has done a wonderful job, starting with Governor Patton back in 1999-2000 about the public water efforts, and it's a fact that somewhere between 95 and 97% of the Commonwealth's population has access to public drinking water, and that is a monumental achievement. But what we have to look towards for the next 20, 30, maybe even 50 years is how we leverage that investment and spring forward and basically operate, maintain, and improve upon what we have in the ground. So that being said, Scott, now you have the crown for the day. So if you were king for a day, so to speak, when it comes to drinking water, wastewater, water resources, water quality, again, how would you help folks, just the layperson, better understand how important that is?
That's a loaded question, Carey.
It is.
In looking back at almost 29 years of direct utility involvement for me, there's one common theme, and I'm kind of build off what Jason said. There's one common theme I've said on various committees and boards, and we always go back as a utility or as a service-minded organization. We do a very poor job of telling our story. And you hear that all the time. I've been saying that for almost 30 years, but yet I don't do a good job of telling our story. And there's a reason for that, because most people within our industry are so service focused that they would rather be out making improvements in the system, doing the things that they need to do every day to ensure that customer has water and has good water or good services. And so we fail to often take the time and devote the resources to telling our story as appropriate as we should. Unfortunately, if you have a utility or an agency that is not very well managed or not very well, from a quality standpoint, it's not very good, someone else is going to tell your story. Mm-hmm. And I think we have, again, opportunity ahead of us that we really need to focus on not only bringing light to the poorly run systems that are within the Commonwealth, but we also should do a better job of focusing on the really well-run systems that are within the Commonwealth and using them as a model to promote our industry as a whole and capitalize off of that opportunity, because it's there. And I think we've got to do a better job of leveraging those resources. And one good thing that come out of the flood, if you want to call it this, is for those of you all that are in this room or that are listening in, there was a huge response from utilities all across the state that responded to come and help these individuals. They didn't have to do that. They did that because they're service-minded individuals, and they wanted to come in and help their brothers and sisters in the utility business get their customers back in water and restore those facilities, because they care about their job. And we really need to focus on that mindset that we have within the Commonwealth, because we do have some devoted and dedicated individuals, and we need to make sure we tell their story.
Couldn't agree more. I'll tell another quick anecdote that some of my colleagues in the Division of Water will probably recognize. But when Disney puts together a Star Wars movie, right, they spend about $200 million when they make that movie, right? So think of that as an infrastructure investment. But they also spend another $200 million marketing that movie, right, selling that movie. So I think in our business, we've done a really good job over the past 20, 30 years of implementing that infrastructure or putting the movie together, so to speak. But we haven't taken that step to market what we've done over time. So I think that's very well stated, and I hope that we're taking some steps to be able to tell our stories better, because it's easier to do now than it's ever been. You know, you can set up interactive story maps and have folks be able to delve into their communities and look at data that's important to them, or at least that we think is important to them. But I think it's also important that we provide a really robust feedback mechanism so that we can listen to the folks, and especially the regulated community, on what their needs are. We see ourselves as dictating what needs to happen to the regulated community, but I think it's also very important for us to understand what the regulated community needs from us as well. So very well said. So John, I'm going to pass the crown to you, sir. If you were king for a day, and given your perspective and your history, no bounds.
So I'm going to go back to something that was successful for us in North Carolina, and that is by collecting those building footprints and by calculating flood damages at multiple intervals and the future, and then defining the mitigating strategies that would reduce loss, we were able to show the value of buying and investing into mitigating strategies against what you would lose. We were able to then calculate that not just at the building individual person's level, but also at a county level, at a state level, to where it became an economic issue. Same concept. I think what people forget about is what would happen if they didn't have clean water, and what would happen if they didn't have water at all. And I think at the individual level, the vulnerability that would occur. At the business level, what lost opportunity, what lost revenue. At the state level, economically, I think if I was king for the day, which will never happen, but if I was king for the day, I think I would clearly define what the financial and vulnerabilities that would come out of not having good water, clean water, as well as wastewater capabilities. So, yeah.
Well said. I'm looking at the screen here, and I see we're starting to get a few questions come in. But I do want to take maybe 30 seconds to put on the crown myself. But also, what I would say with the crown on my proverbial dome would be that we would do this more often. I think that we've got the government represented, we have the private sector represented, we have academia, and we have one of the most robust service industries in Kentucky Rural Water represented up here today. In my estimation, to me, this has been first off a lot of fun. I can't thank you gentlemen enough for joining me to have this conversation first and foremost. But I think we need to have these conversations more often, and in front of folks and in forums that are more attended by those local decision makers and the regional decision makers, to show not only do we intend and want to work together, but we like to work together as well. And it's our job to make Kentucky more resilient, more robust, more successful, not to bring communities down. Our goal is to make Kentucky a safer, healthier, happier place. And John, I know that you're not necessarily from Kentucky, but you bring that perspective, nationally, but certainly as your role in North Carolina as well. So, it's...
Well, and I'm wearing Kentucky blue on my tie. I just have to...
And that's right, and we have to acknowledge the bow tie. John has always been known for his bow tie, kind of like how I'm known for my sweater vests. But I'm very happy that you were able to come with the bow tie and join us today. It does look like we have a couple of questions, so if you gentlemen are okay, I'm going to... Oh, yes, ma'am. Well, of course.
So, speaking for a day, tell me how I can encourage small water utilities in Kentucky to regionalize. Then tell me what you think the benefits of that would be.
Well said. Is it okay if I just want to repeat that? Right. Secretary Goodman asked how small utility, or what would be the incentive for small utilities to regionalize, and I think that this panel is, very well qualified to begin answering that question. So, Dr. Unrine, from a water quality, from a toxicologist standpoint, I know you bring an interesting perspective there. But from a water quality or disinfection byproduct, what would be your perspective on incentivizing regionalization?
Yeah, I mean, I think it could potentially reduce the cost and the complication of regulatory monitoring, you know, and doing the modeling and engineering necessary to meet some of those regulatory requirements, you know, just as an economy of scale. And also, you know, these are complex systems. Even a small water system is so complex that you really need, you know, a computer model to understand how it works. So pulling that technical expertise and also understanding, you know, how these systems that are selling water to each other and have different inputs and things like that affect their water quality, you know, compliance, you know, that could be a helpful thing.
Right.
So.
And it's a responsibility piece, especially if you're selling water to another system. You know, you want to make sure that those consecutive systems, you know, they're serving good water as well. So
Right.
Scott, I mean, from your standpoint, you know, regionalization, Kentucky's been extremely successful, but I think we still have, could have a long way to go when it comes to regionalization. So turn it to you.
I agree, and I'm going to kind of in full transparency and a disclaimer here. I'm going to just back up and rely and make a couple statements based off my previous experience as a utility manager, not necessarily as executive director of Kentucky Rural Water Association. But you know, so much of water systems, both water and wastewater in Kentucky, and missed opportunities, if you want to call it that, from a regionalization standpoint, have not occurred because of the lack of relationships, and either relationships between the utilities or the lack of relationships between the communities. And unfortunately, you know, you wouldn't necessarily, it's easy to get to view that from the 10,000-foot view, either from a regulator standpoint or from an outside agency standpoint, and say, well, you know, that doesn't make sense, or why can't we make this work? But there is definitely a community dynamic there sometimes that can impede progress. And I think that, you know, definitely from a regionalization standpoint, you know, we can sit here all day and talk about the benefits of combining assets and combining technical expertise and combining revenue sources and combining, you know, all the positive things that can come out of regionalization. And of course, you know, ultimately our end goal is improved water quality and improved service and reliability and sustainability. And you know, so that's a really tough. It's a really tough question when you really want to look at that. That I think that we've got, or hopefully my role moving forward will be to continue to foster and develop those relationships amongst communities. And a lot of times it's just one of the things that I've seen in my past is sometimes individuals, whether they're an operator or a utility member or even a manager, sometimes is resistant to change because by someone else coming in and making suggestions, it exposes often a lack of knowledge or a lack of expertise or a lack of. So I think I've got to do a better job moving forward of assisting and helping and bringing some of those things to light where we can foster and facilitate that.
Right. And a lot of it's human psyche. No one likes to be told that they're wrong or what they've been doing is wrong.
Yeah.
But, you know, what we can do is, I think, be more empathetic and show folks, you know, I know this is the way that you've done things, but have you thought about doing it a different way? And if that doesn't work, then we just, you know, the worst thing that someone can tell you when you make a suggestion is no. And luckily, that's not too painful if they, you know, to a certain degree, if they don't take that suggestion. John, I mean, from your perspective, I mean, especially North Carolina national, but as, you know, the funding guru that you are, you know, the incentive for regionalization, I think Scott hit on, you know, the high points of why it's a good idea. But from your perspective, how can we further incentivize it?
Well, I think efficiency and reliability speak for itself. And then I think redundancy, still having the other system, tying those in, because, you know, the storm may not occur everywhere, and you still need that capability for that. I will hit on just a point. We talked about Justice 40 today, Some water systems don't have that that population that you need to have 40% benefit for it. So it allows you to expand what is your population, and you can then become eligible for that. So I think those are certainly ones that tie in there. And then you may also have the ability to bring in other types of clean energy that helps out with those systems. So,
Right.
yeah.
Well, and certainly that's one of the things that the Commonwealth enjoys is a fair number of what we call disadvantaged communities. Sandy Williams talked about it today, and especially through the state revolving fund programs. Basically, the state has the ability to define what a disadvantaged community is each and every year in the intended use plan. Now, we want to look for consistency because we want folks to be able to plan out a few years ahead and be able to apply those dollars. But applying the EJ40 components of the funding that's available, Sandy referred to it as principal forgiveness and not a grant. And I think that's very intelligent to do. But to look at it that way certainly provides the opportunity for tearing down some of these silos that we've had and understanding that the customer bases that a lot of these systems have simply aren't sustainable over time. They've been propped up by grant funds in the past or coal severance funds possibly in the past, but to work together is the only way that we can ensure folks are going to continue to have access to good services through whether it's water or wastewater. Thank you. It looks like Valerie Lucas has a question that came in. Billions of dollars are being invested to replace aging water infrastructure. Oh no, there it went. And now the screen keeps flashing. There we go. But how are we addressing low, uncompetitive wages of the water workforce? Scott, I'm going to point directly at you on this question because I think you have probably the best perspective to be able to, and you've already kind of hit on that fact a bit in the conversation today.
And I'm going to go back to an example. Just in the 3 months that I've been with Rural Water, we got a request, and we won't talk about specifics of the systems, but I got a request from a small system, and they said, listen, we're in a bind. We've lost a certified operator. They've taken a job with a retail establishment where they're going to make more money. And, often what we're seeing, especially in our small rural systems, utilities, is that those competitive wages are not there. And a lot of times individuals that are operating treatment plants or operating distribution or collection systems, they can go into a wealth of other opportunities and make more money. Mm-hmm. And so we haven't had a focus on our I want to call it industry like we should. And by that, I keep going back and I always called my water treatment plant operators scientists because they weren't. They could go in and optimize that treatment process, and through that optimization program, not only reduce chemical usage and energy usage, and it was very easy for our operators to free up $50,000 within an operating budget just by applying the science behind what they were doing. So, and I use that example because it's important that we attract those technically based individuals to come into our workforce to continue to do the things that they need to do. And we've got to have a focus on attraction of qualified individuals within our industry. We have to get, I think, I keep going back to this, but we have to get in front of the decision makers. And often that's not the utility managers. That's the city council members or the county commissioners or people that are setting those competitive wages. And I'll give a couple stats because I know Paulette's holding up the sign. I'll give a couple stats real briefly. And what I want to do is reference the Kentucky Water Workforce Survey that was recently done. But a couple things to keep in mind, and I hope I got this right because I just looked at it this morning. I apologize. But I think roughly 38% of the operators in Kentucky can retire within 6 years, and 40% of the utility managers can retire within 6 years. That's a huge void. And one of the things that really caught my attention, we had an apprenticeship signing earlier or late last week, and our workforce development coordinator gave a couple statistics, and one of them that really caught my eye was less than 2% of the water workforce is under the age of 25. Yeah. So we have this huge void of all these individuals that are going to be retiring out of our industry, and we don't have those qualified individuals that are going to backfill those positions. So, again, I'm going to go to the term opportunity because I think that's a little more attractive in saying, but we have a big opportunity to foster and develop that workforce in our workforce initiatives in Kentucky.
Well, and the simple fact of the matter is those operators perform high-level chemistry every day. So you hit on it as being science, and it absolutely is, because it is very high-level chemistry to be able to treat source water depending on what that source water looks like. John?
I just wanted to bring this up, if I can. AECOM, after I read the bill and we documented all those 418 opportunities, we put that into a system. It's called Fund Navigator. Fund Navigator really was for us to identify some things, but also to work with our clients. We are now providing it free of charge to all public entities. And so if either through Carey or Mike Taylor on our group, if you have an interest in that, we've been talking about a lot of money, just wanted to offer that up for all public entities.
Great. Well, I think that's a great way to conclude the conversation. I noticed that we have another question on screen, and I guess it's a question from the audience, but it's a fun question, and it's a fun one to end the day. Which element do you identify with, earth, wind, fire, or water? So, Dr. Unrine, why don't we start with you?
Well, water, of course. I mean, is there any other way to answer that question? But in actuality, those elements are always combined in nature. They're never separated. But yeah, I would say water.
Well said. Scott?
I'll be brief and say water.
Water? Well said.
I'm not going to change. Water, yeah.
Water. I think I would be extremely remiss as the director of the Division of Water if I didn't say water. But I will also fall back on my roots of earth as a soil scientist at UK. So, but I think that actually evolved into my love for water. So, I really can't thank you gentlemen enough for spending an hour with us this afternoon to talk about your perspectives, and hopefully the folks in the audience, if you didn't learn anything, maybe you learned something about us, and we can follow up and have a conversation on something that you heard. We'd be happy to do that, but I just want to thank you gentlemen for the preparation, for the time, the effort to get here today, and really appreciate it, and hope everything goes well, and I think that concludes the session for the day.